On the Gulf of Mexico, Fulgencio Batista, from his estate near Havana, kept close tabs on the hearings. A shrewd observer of US politics and culture, Batista understood that the hearings posed a significant threat to the American underworld, with which he had strong ties through Lansky. Although presented by the media as a disaster for organized crime, Batista knew better. The New York Times compared the key for the hearings to the passing of the 21st Amendment, which had ended Prohibition, but Batista was not swayed by these dramatic headlines. He knew that despite the crackdown on casinos and illegal operations, the Mafia's core strategy, keeping money in circulation, remained unchanged. Capital, after all, needed to flow. Lansky, Luciano and their colleagues understood this principle well. They had embraced a corporate mindset, and their first rule of business was to generate and reinvest capital. The K4 hearings had shut down many of their operations, but the mob still needed places to invest its dirty money. And in Batista's eyes, Havana, with its glitzy appeal and proximity to the US, had never looked more enticing as a safe haven for their capital. However, there was one major problem. If Batista was going to capitalize on Havana as a hub for mob investment, he needed to be in control. So, in March 1951, around the same time Lansky was giving his third testimony before the K4 committee, Batista made a bold announcement. He was running for president in the June 1952 Cuban elections. The reaction was lukewarm at best. Many Cubans were unsurprised. Batista's recent political moves as a senator from Las Villas had made his intentions clear. But enthusiasm was lacking. While Batista still retained some popularity, particularly within the military and rural areas where he was seen as a guajira, or peasant at heart, much had changed since he went into self-imposed exile nearly 8 years earlier. Cuba had experienced a decade of constitutional democracy, giving rise to a turbulent mix of competing political factions. The Auténtico party, backed by President Carlos Prio, had already chosen its candidate, and the Ortodoxo party, with its strong support from unions and student groups, was a force to be reckoned with. Even the Communist Party, which Batista had successfully manipulated in the past, was a wild card. Despite his name recognition and attempts to revitalize his image, his campaign poster featured him in a suave linen suit, towering over Havana with the slogan, "Este es el hombre," "This is the man." His campaign floundered. By December 1951, a public opinion poll published in the magazine Bohemia showed Batista running a distant third. In later accounts, Batista would claim that a group of young military officers had approached him with alarming intelligence. They had uncovered evidence that President Carlos Prio was planning a coup d'état. According to this account, Prio intended to cancel the upcoming elections and maintain power through paramilitary force. Prio vehemently denied any such plot, insisting it was pure fabrication. Regardless, by early 1952, Batista was already holding secret meetings with key military leaders, solidifying his plans for his own coup. As Cuba was engrossed in its annual pre-Lenten carnival in March 1952, with the streets filled with music and celebration, Batista decided the time was ripe to act. In the early hours of March 10th, a convoy of vehicles quietly made its way to Camp Columbia, Cuba's central military headquarters just outside Havana. Stepping out of one car, Batista was greeted by members of a revolutionary junta that included several high-ranking officers. Speaking to his assembled supporters, Batista instructed, "We must be very careful that no news gets out until we have this matter properly adjusted. Have the radio stations been taken care of?" He was reassured that all major radio stations, newspapers and other media outlets were under military control. Satisfied, Batista gave the green light for a formation of tanks and combat vehicles to proceed to the presidential palace. Once the palace was surrounded, President Prio was given an ultimatum: leave the presidency or face the consequences. With little resistance, Prio fled, first seeking asylum at the Mexican embassy and eventually into exile in Miami. Batista's coup d'état had been swift and efficient, with only a single casualty, a military officer who had resisted. When Cubans woke up that morning, they were greeted by a stark announcement broadcast over the radio. Fulgencio Batista was once again their president. By the late afternoon, the new government issued a manifesto. The military junta has acted to avoid the regime of blood and corruption that has destroyed our institutions, creating disorder and mockery in the state, aggravated by the sinister plans of the government, which intended to extend its rule beyond its constitutional term, conspiring with certain military leaders to launch a coup before the elections. It was a textbook example of the big lie tactic. Batista, who had just staged the coup himself, claimed it was necessary to prevent a coup by Prio. He wasted no time in consolidating power. The constitution was suspended, the upcoming elections were cancelled, all political parties were dissolved, and labor union strikes were banned for 45 days by executive decree. With a chilling proclamation, Batista told the public, "The people and I are the dictators." Initially, the Cuban populace seemed stunned into silence. Historian Hugh Thomas compared the mood to the aftermath of a personal nervous breakdown following years of chronic illness. In his detailed history, Cuba, Pursuit of Freedom, Thomas remarked, "The prostitutes of Virtue Street knew that the substitution of Batista for Prio in the National Palace would make little difference to them. The Cuban political system, such as it was, had already been tortured to death. The accumulated follies of 50 years were bearing their rotten fruit." Internationally, the reaction was more telling. Within just 2 weeks of Batista's blatant power grab, the Truman administration in the United States officially recognized his government, extending all diplomatic courtesies to the man who had overthrown Cuba's democracy. The swiftness of US support was further highlighted by Time magazine, which ran a cover story featuring Batista's smiling face, haloed by the Cuban flag, under the carefree headline, "Cuba's Batista, he got past democracy's sentries." Here is that very article. One dazzling day last week, the 40-year-old gunboat Cuba steamed out of Havana harbor, coasting close under the grey, weathered walls of Morro Castle, and set course northeast through the blue Atlantic. At her foremast flew a pennant the Cuban breezes had not played with for 7 years. The blue, white, red, yellow, and green personal banner of General Fulgencio Batista. Aboard the Cuba was the general himself. He was headed for an Easter weekend holiday with his family on palm-lined Varadero Beach. Relaxing on the awning deck in shorts, the strong man was in his best bluff humor. Once again he was undisputed dictator of Cuba. In an almost bloodless coup last month, the tough ex-sergeant had toppled President Carlos Prio. Now, Prio was in Miami exile. His powerful labor movement had knuckled under to the new ruler. Congress was suspended on full pay, and Batista was dictator and provisional president under a brand new set of statutes he himself had proclaimed to the Cuban people. Nobody seemed perturbed by the coup, and throngs of other Cubans followed their boss's lead by flocking off to their own carefree weekends, as though they had never had it better in their lives. The prize Batista recaptured is a lush green tropical treasure island, producing record amounts of sugar and an annual governmental income of some $350 million. Its exuberant Havana is one of the world's most fabled fleshpots. The whole world dances to its sexy rumbas and mambos. Its socialites dine off gold plate, and its sumptuous casinos are snowed under by the pesos of sugar-rich playboys. The dance of the millions that Cuba knew in its brief post-World War I sugar boom is going again full blast. Batista brought off his coup at the top of Cuba's market. Power and prestige are two things Batista understands and values. It has been said of him that he has limitless ambition, plenty of ability, and no respect for his fellow men. With those who do not cross him, he can be pleasant and even jovial. At 51, he is a hairy, muscular man's man, with the swarthy brow and barrel chest of a smaller Max Schmeling. He revels in the authority he has won back. His return followed the classic pattern of Latin American revolutions. Every traditional element was present. A bold, shrewd strongman, a hard core of army malcontents, a weak government. Similar combinations have brought army men to power in many other Latin countries, see box. In this case, it remained only for Batista and friends to write in the characteristically Cuban touches. Who? Me. Early this year, a group of junior army officers, claiming to be disgusted by the careless way in which the cynical Prio government was running Cuba, called on Batista and asked him to lead a revolt. As one of 3 candidates campaigning for the presidency at elections scheduled for June 1st, Batista declined. But late in February, Batista got word that the army revolt might be attempted, whether he led it or not. By that time, it may also have dawned on him that he had small chance of winning at the polls. As the strong man blandly explained the situation, the young officers became restless, and they put themselves in touch with me. Batista heeded his countrymen's importunate pleas and plunged into conspiratorial planning with some of his old comrades. There were 27 men in the plot, but, until the night before the rising, only Batista knew who all of them were. He himself wrote out the master plan and orders, employing a kind of ecclesiastical code. If any outsider got a look at the plans, they must have read like an outline for a religious pageant. Each reference to an archbishop or a priest signified an individual, each ceremony a place to be captured. At the final night meeting, in a house not far from Havana's all-important Camp Columbia army base, the plotters swore an oath of secrecy. Batista told the conspirators to check their watches against Radio Reloj, the Havana radio station that ticks off time signals day and night. The revolution would start at exactly 2:45 in the morning on March 10th. Are you with us? Early on the appointed night, Batista returned from the old colonial seaport town of Matanzas, where he had made a routine campaign speech. At his suburban estate, Cuquin, he told his pretty wife, Marta, that he was tired and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., 4 officers called for him. He dressed in the dark. There was a shaky laugh when a nervous aide who thought he was holding the chief's jacket tried to help him slip his arms into a pair of trousers. The conspirators climbed into a car and headed for Camp Columbia. At the gate, the driver leaned out and said, "It's Batista. Are you with us?" The sentry joined the revolt on the spot. It was a symbolic moment. Batista had got past democracy's sentries as well as Camp Columbia's, and he had achieved complete surprise. The Prio government had not the slightest inkling that the strong man was on the prowl. The U.S. State Department, which takes an understandable interest in Cuba's affairs, was caught completely unaware. One Cuban, sourly reflecting on events the morning after, jibed, "The town is full of FBI agents trying to find out what happened." Once inside the camp, the rebels' first act was to capture the Archbishop, Chief of Staff General Ruperto Cabrera, who was taken in his ornate cream and gold bed. Several bishops, colonels, were also arrested. Batista set up his command post at camp headquarters. Within an hour, the camp was his. The troops were roused, and Batista addressed them, swaying them to his side with one of the oldest of military maxims. He doubled their pay. "We are the law." Picked officers took downtown Havana's Cabana fortress. Others seized naval and air centers. From these bases, they took control of police stations, communication centers, and the labor palace. The rest of the island, there were only 2 regiments outside Havana, fell soon afterward. The young officers crowded round Batista at his table in Colombia and crowed, "Fulge, we're in!" Prio took refuge at the Mexican embassy. "We are the law," proclaimed Batista, sending tanks and armored cars through the streets of Havana. Cubans hardly needed to be told. Political foes rushed to make deals with the new boss. Gangsters stopped shooting at each other. Employers reported an abrupt end to such familiar nuisances as wildcat strikes and absenteeism. Cubans remembered Batista. In the past, he had used castor oil, midnight arrests, or gunplay. His soldiers had ruthlessly put down abortive rebellions. He could afford to be economical with the weapon of terror. "It is my destiny to make bloodless revolutions," he bragged, and added a significant qualification. "The only blood spilled will be that of those who oppose us." In the old days, Batista liked to roister long past midnight with ex-sergeant cronies. Now the ex-sergeants are out of the picture, and Batista is alone. The strong man is a big boy now. As one Cuban says, "Batista does not love and does not hate. He will sacrifice his best friend and pardon his bitterest enemy if it serves his purpose." This political formula has not made him popular, but it works. Smiles Batista. "I am a dictator with the people," the stenographer dictates. With or against the people, the strong man, at any rate, came from them. The son of a poor farmer of mixed blood, he was born in 1901, while his country was still under US occupation, at the eastern sugar town of Baines. Quitting Baines's Quaker school at 12, he worked as a tailor's apprentice, bartender, barber, banana picker, cane cutter, and railroad hand. At 20, he joined the army. To other soldiers, he was virtually a literary type. There was always a book or magazine under the pillow of his bunk. When he got the chance, he studied shorthand and became a sergeant stenographer, handling secret papers, working with high officers, traveling around. Batista was still a sergeant at 30, as the Great Depression settled down on Cuba. Sugar then sold for half a cent a pound, banks foreclosed on planters, cane cutters roamed the island seeking a few weeks' seasonal work at 20C for a dawn-to-dark day. Those were the years of the tyrannous President Machado and his infamous gangs of gunmen hired to repress the people by terror and torture. Rebellion was in the air. Students led strikes, and the ABC Revolutionary Society hurled bombs at Machado's hated police. President Roosevelt sent Sumner Welles to help ease Machado out without an insurrection. Machado went, and Cuba exploded in the celebrated Sergeant's Revolt. On September 4, 1933, Sergeant Batista, the ringleader, walked into Camp Columbia headquarters, pistol in hand, and told the army chief he was relieved of duty. Battle of the National Hotel. Waving away the presidency, Batista put the student's idol, Professor Ramon Grau San Martin, at the head of the government. But the sergeant upped himself to colonel and chief of staff and fired almost the entire Army Officers Corps. The ousted officers holed up in the National Hotel. Batista sent soldiers to disarm them. Welles, who lived at the hotel, stopped that showdown by seating himself midway between the rival forces in the long lobby and imperturbably discussing Emily Dickinson's poetry with advisor Adolf Berle until the soldiers withdrew. But 25 days later, fighting broke out at the hotel. After Batista's soldiers had lobbed 200 shells into the building, the officers surrendered. Batista, then only 32, was master of Cuba. Back in Washington as Assistant Secretary of State, Welles arranged for U.S. recognition, a quota for Cuba in the U.S. sugar market, and abrogation of the odious Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene to keep order in Cuba. Though Batista had endless trouble finding the right president, he tried out 7 in 7 years and finally took over the job himself, order and prosperity gradually returned to the island. With prosperity, a new decorum settled on Batista. His table manners improved, he got a tailor and a manicurist, acquired millionaire friends and some notions of good taste. Visiting Washington in 1938, he found out that his official host, Chief of Staff General Marlin Craig, usually wore just 2 decorations. Tossing his own beribboned tunic to an aide, he roared, "Rip off all but the 2 top rows." When he called on President Roosevelt a few days later, he confided that he was getting up a new constitution and asked FDR's opinion on whether presidents should succeed themselves. FDR solemnly assured him that they should not, and what is more, should not even succeed their successors. "It's the only way," said FDR, "to prevent dynasties." Batista was much impressed. He wrote a non-succession provision into his constitution. So, after finishing his own 4-year term in 1944, he could not lawfully stand again for the presidency till this year. Off to Florida. In 1944, democracy was on the march in all the main theaters of war, and dictators were out of season. In that whiny atmosphere, Batista tried something brand new in Latin American dictator politics. He ran off a free and fair election. His man was soundly beaten. This was annoying, but there was nothing to do but graciously turn the presidency over to the winner, his old colleague Grau San Martin, and get out. Besides, staying in Havana at the time would have been asking for a Tommy gun clip in the back. The ex-strongman departed for Florida and applied himself to setting his personal affairs in order, notably arranging to divorce his first wife, Elise, and marry again. Money was no problem. 11 years of managing payrolls, contracts, the national lottery, sugar quotas, and other traditional means of political enrichment had made him enormously wealthy. Havana insiders estimate his fortune at $50 million and credit him with one of the handsomest gestures ever made by an active, vigorous man who wanted a younger and prettier mate. He reportedly gave Elise a 12-story apartment house, other valuable property, and $8 million in cash. Soon afterward, Batista married his present wife, Marta Fernandez. The president had literally run into her with his car a few years earlier while she was riding a bicycle down Fifth Avenue in Havana's swank Miramar district. She has borne Batista 3 children. He also had 3 children by his first wife. In exile, the Batistas lived at Daytona, where the ex-president liked to row in the Halifax River and browse in his library. He also looked after his extensive Florida real estate investments, which reportedly include several big Miami Beach hotels. He ran for senator in absentia in 1948 and was elected. In 1949, Grau having given way to Carlos Prio as president, Batista finally went home. Guarded by 20 soldiers, he lived at Cuquine, talking with politicos, playing canasta, and keeping trim by working out daily on an exercise machine. There he bided his time until last month's revolt. Pork and passports. Why was there practically no opposition when Batista pulled his coup? The basic answer is that 7 years of riotously rotten government had left the average Cuban too cynical about democracy to fight in its behalf. When Grau San Martin was swept into office in 1944, on a wave of popular demand for housecleaning, he said, "There is nothing wrong with Cuba that an honest administration can't cure." Then the scholarly professor and his successor proceeded to give the island, which had seen plenty of corruption in its time, the most graft and gangster-ridden government in its history. Cuba's freewheeling Democrats operated according to the rule, stated by a former Grau minister, "It's a credit to you if you're honest, but it's no great discredit if you're dishonest." Everybody helped himself. Senators who had spent $500,000 buying enough votes to win got their investment back in millions. For the president's congressional friends, there was $4 million, a month ration from the state lottery pork barrel. Sticky-fingered politicos picked up fortunes on contracts, customs deals, sugar quota allocations, suits and suitcases. It was wonderful fun for the highbinders who could get it. Still pending in a Havana court is a lawsuit brought by an orthodox Reform Party senator, demanding that Grau and his ministers, including Prio, explain what happened to $174,241,840.14 that seemed to have disappeared during Grau's regime. The senator's title for his case, the greatest theft in history. But the greatest of thieves is not named in the suite. José Manuel Alemán, Grau's favorite minister, who stole not one but an estimated $100 million, died in 1949. One story told of Alemán in Havana. On the afternoon of October 10, 1948, he and some henchmen drove 4 Ministry of Education trucks into the Treasury building. All climbed out carrying suitcases. "What are you going to do? Rob the Treasury?" joshed a guard. "Quién sabe?" replied baby-faced José Alemán. Forthwith, his men scooped pesos, francs, escudos, lire, rubles, pounds sterling, and about $19 million in US currency into the suitcases. The trucks made straight for the airfield, where a chartered DC-3 stood waiting. Alemán and 3 henchmen took the US money aboard, leaving the rest to be changed later at Cuban banks. In Miami, he carried the currency to the DuPont building headquarters of his $70 million Florida real estate empire, where, an employee has said, bundles of $1,000 bills were tossed around like wrapped packages of pennies. Later, a reporter asked Alemán, "How did you get all that money out of the treasury?" "It was easy," said Alemán, "in suitcases. Pleasures and palaces." Ex-President Prio also did well for himself, apparently without the use of suitcases. When he was a student and budding politico, Prio said, "There wasn't a peseta in the house to go to the movies." By the time he was senator, he was a millionaire, owning at least 2 houses and 2 country estates. While president, he quietly built one of the hemisphere's most fabulous mansions at La Chata near Havana. The place has an air-conditioned barbershop, a zoo, a stable of Arabian horses, and a swimming pool, with a small waterfall on one side, and a dining terrace, bar, and kitchen on the other. Its estimated value is somewhere between $1 million and $3 million. Prio's presidential salary, $25,000 a year. In spite of its graft and corruption, there was some good to be said for Cuba's 7-year-old democratic regime. Havana under Grau and Prio was a haven of free speech and free thought. They built schools, hospitals and highways. They gave Cuba a national bank, made loans to expand industry and diversify agriculture, and improved labor standards in a land plagued by seasonal unemployment. And, despite fantastic sums spent to sway elections, they kept the way open for democratic change. There was at least an even chance that an honest man would have won the June 1st election. The result of Batista's coup is that the cynical old political practices will go on as before. Batista gave the lottery to the same lieutenant who handled it for him under his earlier dictatorship. He placed the customs, a traditional source of political enrichment, in army hands. In scrupulous conformity with the existing code, he left Prio's personal properties untouched, just as Prio had never laid a hand on his. Southern Democrats? The US people like to believe that the whole Western Hemisphere is safe for democracy. The fact is that, with a few such exceptions as Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, the list is always subject to change, most Latin American countries are not democracies in the sense understood in the US. The notion that they are is an illusion. Fostered during World War II under the Good Neighbor policy, in Latin America, democracy has special meanings. In Juan Perón's Argentina, democracy is a boss and his wife on a balcony, plus social justice, wage rises, free cakes at Christmas, old age benefits, for all who bow down to them. In some of the Andean countries, democracy tends to be government by a majority of the white minority. Under the Honduran formula, ex-dictator Bucho Carillas once explained, "Personal safety is as important as personal liberty." Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, last of the old-fashioned monster-type dictators, calls his regime in the Dominican Republic freedom and democracy in the Caribbean. Said a tough US businessman, hardened by 20 years in Latin lands, "When a guy says democracy down here, he means any government that's run the way he wants it run. For some Latinos, of course, democracy has more significant meanings. The Uruguayans recently exchanged their president for a committee-style government, akin to the Swiss. Mexicans have given the Indian absolute political equality. Brazil, the land of 50 million whites and Negroes, carries day-by-day racial democracy to a point far beyond anything the US can match. Is it workable? But Latin American countries are a long way from being democratic in the US sense. Their history, geography, climate, religion, race are all different. As colonies of Spain and Portugal, they had none of the prior experience in self-government that the 13 North American colonies enjoyed. In such countries as Bolivia and Ecuador, backward, illiterate, aborigines who do not even speak Spanish far outnumber the whites. The entire area sags below the standards of health, education, and economic development that political scientists consider essential for durable democracy. Even in relatively prosperous Cuba, per capita income is $300 compared to the US's $1,600. Average life expectancy is almost 15 years less than in the United States. Illiteracy is 7 times as great. Self-discipline in the exercise of political liberties is also needed to keep democracy stable. Latinos are individualists, insistent upon personal as distinct from political liberty. They are men of passion, men of honor. Lord Bryce, writing in 1912, noted in them a temper which holds every question to be one of honor. Sometimes in the flurry of upholding honor and individual rights, some of the quieter ground rules of social conduct have a tendency to get lost in the shuffle. A Cuban joke defines democracy as having a good job and the right to drive on the wrong side of the street. The great world capital of Buenos Aires, population 3,371,000, has no traffic lights. The authorities tried the signals out some years ago, but had to remove them because drivers simply would not obey them. If the Latino individualist seems ever ready to fight, or at least duel, for his sacred personal rights, the record shows that he also goes in heavily for hero worship. Since Bolivar's day, Latin Americans have tended to follow men rather than parties or principles. They call themselves Peronistas, Arnulfistas, in Panama, Ibañistas, in Chile. Most of their caudillos, their strong men, have come from the army. Currently, military men preside over 11 Latino governments. Instead of confining themselves to the job of defending their country, Latin American militarists are entrenched as the only well-organized political party in every country except Costa Rica, Uruguay, Chile, and perhaps Colombia. In many countries, the army consumes an inordinate share of the national income and fosters the belief that it alone is fit to rule. It was armed power that put Batista back in Cuba. Other men had the votes, he had the guns. Is it wanted? Because revolutions often become epidemic, some fear that the Batista coup and last week's Bolivian revolt may be followed by explosions elsewhere, possibly in Ecuador or Colombia. But nobody in Latin America, except the communists and the neo-fascist fringe, professes to want any other kind of government except democracy. In the long run, as hunger and ignorance are dealt with, democracy may yet win in Latin America, though it is likely to be quite different from the US variety. That democracy must come from within, not from without. It is up to Cubans, not the US, to make military coups obsolete. Meanwhile, as far as Latin America is concerned, the US can only be the good neighbor, avoid undue interference, practice point 4, and cultivate the long view. The making of democracy takes, among other things, time, the end. For many Cubans, US backing of a man who had so brazenly trampled the country's constitution was a deep insult that would never be forgotten or forgiven. Batista's coup was a betrayal of democratic principles, and the fact that the US so quickly legitimized his regime rubbed salt in the wound. Not everyone in Cuba accepted this new reality without protest. One man, whose political ambitions had been derailed by Batista's brazen move, would go on to become Batista's fiercest enemy, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. Castro, whose personal trajectory had been altered by Batista's coup, would channel his frustration into a revolution of his own, setting the stage for a seismic shift in Cuban history. As a candidate from the Ortodoxo party, Fidel Castro had been on track to win a seat in Congress, with solid chances in the upcoming election. But just 80 days before the vote, Batista abruptly cancelled everything. 3 days later, Castro's fury boiled over in a fiery pamphlet that flooded the streets of Havana. In a scathing denunciation, he declared, "Batista's military coup is no revolution, but a shameless seizure of power. These men are no patriots. They are destroyers of liberty, usurpers, adventurers, thirsty for gold and control. And you, Batista, after fleeing like a coward for 4 years and wasting 3 more in empty politicking, now slither back with your poisonous remedy, shredding the Constitution to bits. Once again, we hear the stomp of military boots. Once again, Camp Columbia dictates decrees, installs and removes ministers at will. Once again, tanks roar menacingly in our streets. Once again, brute force tramples reason. Nothing in the world is more bitter than the sight of a people who go to bed free, only to wake up in chains." Castro's rage captured the deep frustration many Cubans felt. Coups in Cuba were not new, but they were typically hard-fought battles with bloodshed and political maneuvering. Batista's coup, on the other hand, unfolded in the dead of night, more like a silent assault than a drawn-out conflict. Castro and others who saw themselves as champions of social justice were caught off guard. In the face of Batista's brute force, resistance seemed futile. Secret meetings were held, manifestos distributed, and weapons stockpiled. But it would take months before any organized action could be launched against the regime. As Fulgencio Batista's sudden rise to power threw Cuba into turmoil, the full extent of corruption in the ousted Carlos Prio administration began to surface. Among those most outraged was the one and only Fidel Castro, whose political ambitions had been derailed by Batista's coup. Castro, deeply disturbed by the pervasive graft and exploitation that defined Prio's presidency, would soon channel his frustration into a revolutionary movement that would shake the very foundation of Cuban history. This article delves into the staggering scale of wealth accumulation during the Prio administration, where millions of dollars meant for public projects and national development were siphoned off into private pockets. From real estate tax fraud to public works graft and blackmail by terrorist groups, corruption seemed to be the lifeblood of the regime. Fidel Castro, one of the first to publicly denounce these abuses, highlighted the sheer audacity of an administration that had, for years, thrived on its betrayal of the Cuban people. Fidel Castro's strong stance against corruption and corrupt political figures should have served as a clear warning for people like Traficante. Despite this, Traficante and others chose to ignore the signs and even went as far as to support Castro by arming him, missing the opportunity to foresee the consequences of their actions. During the first few days of Fulgencio Batista's revolution, Americans in the know behaved in a strangely un-American fashion. They refused to ride in Cadillacs. The reason was simple, yet prudent. The Cadillac had become the symbol of Carlos Prio's graft-ridden government. To be seen in one was to invite the attention of Batista's trigger-happy gunmen. There is no question that the Prio administration, thrown out this week by General Batista, carried on the accumulation of wealth on a truly magnificent scale. Even the enemies of the Prio regime seemed to take pride in the enormity of its corruption. Ernesto de la Fe, General Batista's official press agent, bluntly charged that out of a $400 million annual budget, the people around Prio divided $30 million in graft. He accused Prio himself of becoming about $40 million richer during his 3.5-year term as president. Non-Cubans familiar with the country called these figures too large, but refused to dismiss them entirely. As one put it, maybe you should knock off $5 or $10 million here or there, but maybe you shouldn't. What everyone agrees on is that many millions of taxpayers' dollars found their way into politicians' bank accounts. There were apparently 4 principal ways to get rich quick under the Prio regime: real estate tax schemes, public works, the national lottery, and blackmail by terrorist groups. The Prio government spent $5 million a month on public works. Enemies charged that $2 million of this was graft. A 500-yard tunnel being built under a river here costs $5 million. Prio's opponents claimed that under ordinary conditions, the taxpayers could have had the tunnel for $3 million. Tied in with these public works and other alleged government services were purported payoffs to revolutionary groups, which in Cuban terms often meant gangsters. Fidel Castro, former president of the University Students' Federation, filed a notarized statement with the Tribunal of Accounts, charging that the Prio administration distributed $18,000 a month to the heads of various terrorist outfits. These payments, he said, were covered up by listing 2,120 non-existent jobs. Fidel Castro also charged that, in the past 3 years, the Prio regime acquired 34 fincas in one province alone. These were luxury estates, complete with swimming pools and cabana clubs. Fidel Castro noted that honest office holders often have difficulty acquiring such expensive properties, and cited several instances in which fincas valued at $300,000 were listed on the tax books at only $60,000. The Prio administration's manipulation of the national lottery was a little less grandiose, according to its accusers. Politicians are said to have sold 44,000 tickets wholesale at 18 cents each to a select group of allies. These tickets were then resold to distributors, and by the time they reached consumers, people were paying 30 cents instead of the established price of 25 cents. The total take was estimated to be between $90,000 and $125,000 a year. Finally, there were payoffs to congressmen, Prio's enemies claimed. According to reports, one liberal congressman supposedly received $60,000 for his tie-breaking vote on a crucial piece of legislation 2 years ago. In the meantime, Batista held all the power. The new president wasted no time in consolidating his rule. He took control of Cuba's financial institutions and devised a system to siphon the country's wealth for his own benefit. While many failed to see the significance of this at the time, it was a major turning point in the relationship between Batista's regime and the American Mafia in Havana.